Welcome to the first Nex Gen podcast series produced by the LIDC, Ligue internationale du droit de la concurrence, International League of Competition Law. Throughout a series of 7 episodes, our expert guests will explore the intersection of competition law with emerging technologies like cloud computing and artificial intelligence, and will delve into the legal, economic, and policy challenges these innovations pose to competition regulation worldwide. All the views expressed throughout this podcast are the speaker's own and do not represent the views of the LIDC nor any of the companies and organizations with whom the speakers may be affiliated or the clients they represent.
It's a pleasure to introduce this third podcast in the series on competition in cloud and AI. In the last session, we were thinking very much about alternative visions to the current status quo and the AI stack. Now we're actually going to take a deep dive into cloud. So we're going to really consider what some of the key competition concerns are that have been raised. And we're going to refer in particular to the EU Data Act. If I can hand over to Shruti, who I think is going to set the scene and introduce some of these competition concerns for us.
Thanks, Ben. Antitrust authorities around the world are showing a lot of regulatory interest in competition in the cloud sector. Australia, Japan, Netherlands, South Korea, France, they've all already completed market studies to assess the impact of competition with respect to cloud services. Spain, the UK and US have all started investigations, and they're at different stages of the investigation into competition in cloud services. And so we'll be hearing more from these authorities and maybe more as well in the coming months and years. But I'll focus my comments on the UK Competition and Market Authority's market investigation into competition cloud services, because that's probably been the most detailed that I've seen, compared to any of the other authorities. And just for the benefit of everyone on this podcast, the UK Competition Markets Authority I'll be referring to going forward as the CMA. So what are the key concerns that have been raised by the CMA? The first one is potential market concentration. So the CMA is investigating whether the market is concentrated with only a few large cloud service providers, such that customers then have little choice when they're choosing their cloud provider. I think this concern needs to be viewed against a backdrop of the fact that there are also other IT providers. Firstly, there are several cloud providers, but there are also other IT providers like on-premises providers. Customers also have other options like hybrid options. They could use on-premises providers for some of the IT needs. They could also, and then use cloud providers for some other IT needs. So customers do have several options. But like I said, the authority is investigating whether there is market concentration with respect to cloud services in particular. The next issue the CMA is looking at in a fair bit of detail is data transfer fees. And the concern here is that data transfer fees are potentially so expensive that they could potentially be preventing customers from switching cloud providers due to the costs involved. I think that issue has now sort of been addressed, at least in the EU, with the Data Act that you mentioned, because the Data Act does mandate that data transfer fees basically be zero, or there be no data transfer fees for customers that want to switch between cloud providers. There's a third concern, and that relates to data portability and interoperability. And there, the CMA is assessing whether limitations in data portability and interoperability between different cloud providers can create dependencies on certain providers or affect users' ability to move their data or integrate their services across different providers. I'd say the counter view there is that, there are, while there may not be perfect interoperability. There are providers who are working on solutions that ease movement between different providers. There are also industry consortia or standards bodies that are working to create voluntary standards in the industry without a legislator coming in and imposing certain standards. And we've seen that, for example, with the development of Kubernetes over a period of time. That has now sort of become the standard, and that's not been imposed by any particular authority as such. But it's something that the industry has itself agreed to. The next issue is committed spend agreements. And there the CMA is reviewing whether committed spend agreements limit customer flexibility by maybe locking them into long-term commitments with major cloud providers. And there, I'd say one needs to also consider that committed agreements like this also offer customers cost savings and price stability. And so while you can look at it from the lens of whether it's locking in customers, there are also certain advantages that it's offering the customer. And as Sean was mentioning in an earlier episode, given the high costs involved in some of this, do you want to take away customers, the advantages that customers can gain from these kinds of agreements if they offer certain price stability and discounts? So those are points to think about. And the last sort of practice I'll touch upon that the CMA is investigating is unfair licensing practices. So the CMA is investigating whether certain licensing practices by major cloud providers could unfairly restrict competition, such as requiring customers to pay additional fees or adhere to restrictive terms if they use software on rival cloud providers. That's hopefully that's a bit of scene setting for you in terms of the sort of key concerns that authorities are looking into, but interested to hear how this links into the Data Act.
Sure, that's perfect. Such an interesting reflection on the CMA, because I know that Sean and I have written about this very issue. We've also responded to the Competition and Markets Authority and Ofcom's studies. And I think that you've got to be careful with some of these conclusions that are raised sometimes by both Ofcom and the Competition and Markets Authority, because what we've found is that they don't always necessarily match up with the empirical research that underpins the studies. And so, if you forgive me for reading from the Ofcom study, but there's a very, very telling, I think, conclusion that comes out of the empirical market research, which is that quite most decision makers acknowledge that a de facto lock-in exists. This is primarily a function of internal factors rather than provider-imposed restrictions. And equally, it goes on to say that the qualitative research that was undertaken for Ofcom has uncovered limited evidence of switching together with limited desire to do so. And I think that these are really important things to just factor against this. Ultimately, customers are on the way in. They're on the way in on the journey into contracting with cloud providers. And so, of course, something that we've touched on in an earlier podcast is this issue of skills. And I would imagine that really one of the key factors here that's an internal factor for lock-in, which is not any consequence of provider terms, unfair contracting, etc., is simply that those firms that are on the way in haven't necessarily got the in-house technical capability to immediately initiate a cost-efficient, time-efficient switch. And so I suppose that for and I'm speaking for Sean as well here, which is that I guess that for us the concern with the EU Data Act is that it comes in really early in the game and imposes a variety of really rather stringent obligations on all cloud service providers without necessarily giving time, let's say, for this to mature and for us to understand whether genuinely there are issues.
I really loved what you said, because for me, I've done a lot of cloud migrations, and a lot of cloud contracts. And for my clients, one of the hardest things when I'm working with them is actually on, why are you putting this much data in the cloud? And oftentimes they say, oh, we can't delete any of it. I'm like, when we're migrating, and I'm like, this is the perfect time to start deleting the useless data because it's going to cut your storage costs. And so what we've developed is a solution that basically uses AI to identify what data is valuable and what data, firstly, should you have gotten rid of a long time ago under law, and then secondly, what data don't you need to migrate? And we can drastically reduce those migration costs. But to me, the migration problem was not a service provider issue. It was on, companies having no idea what data they have in the cloud and having no idea why they were migrating it in the first place, other than, it's a bit cheaper. And I think my concern with the way that the EU regulation approaches this is it says, well, now it's free to migrate. You can migrate anything anywhere. Is that actually of value? Do we want to be migrating huge amounts of useless data around different data centers? Yeah. I'm not sure there's much value in that.
Yeah. I think that's a fantastic point, because everyone's looking at it from the perspective of how do we rein the cloud service providers in. But I think it's important to sort of not take away the responsibility of customers, who are often quite sophisticated themselves in terms of thinking about how they can manage their own costs. Because one of, we talked about free data transfer for switching, but the EU Data Act is also trying to address data transfer costs in the context of multi-clouding. And if you then go ahead and make data transfer costs for multi-clouding free as well, then that takes away any responsibility of the customer who is not spending or investing into the infrastructure, which costs quite a lot, to actually think about how much it wants to transfer.
And I think, that you've divorced the fact that I own this data and I have a responsibility and a cost. You've then divorced that cost.
Absolutely.
So you've divorced any incentive to really clean up your data, other than incentives imposed by privacy law.
Yes.
So that's the way we're able to get in with our technology, is through privacy law. But what all of our clients, after we do this exercise, end up saying is, oh my gosh, the efficiencies we get from knowing where our data is amazing. The things we've been able to do for our business are amazing. But because they can't see that, or there's no requirement.
I think that's fascinating. Sean, would you?
Yeah, I just want to come in on this interoperability requirements that are being put into place, and the idea of equivalent services being possible between different cloud providers. So this is within European regulation, still perhaps to be finely defined, but the basic principles are there. That and there's potentially a real danger with decreeing that different cloud providers have to be able to offer equivalent services. One of the reasons for that danger is that there's actually a lot of variation in terms of the fine details of what's in the offering of different cloud providers. And obviously there are some of the major providers, but there are lesser market share providers as well. And they're all differentiating themselves in terms of innovations they have, in terms of the products and features on their cloud. So I don't think the cloud's offerings are identical. It's not like storing a JPEG photo. Oh, I can go here or I can go there. It's much more complex than that. And so the statement that a business user should be able to move any aspect of their operation to another cloud provider basically means that the other cloud providers have to somehow have access to the features that have been offered on the initial one. And how does that happen?
Yeah.
How does that happen? Does that mean that the initial one must make their intellectual property and trade secrets available to the other operators as a matter of standard practice? There's an exception where it seems like there's been a unique feature developed for a client, but if there's not a unique feature, then there's supposed to be equivalence, and that you have to step back and say, what does that mean for the cloud provider's incentive to undertake innovation within Europe?
Absolutely.
What does
Could
it
you
mean?
give us an idea of what those features kind of look like?
Yeah, so it can be things about security levels, speeds of operation, ways of interaction between different parts of the cloud, and within our a paper that I've co-written with Ben, there's a description of features of different cloud operators that have been pulled out, and then the question is asked, what percentage of features are common among cloud operators, and what percentage, and how many of these features this is from a paper that's written for businesses trying to decide which operator to use.
Because,
Right?
that's what we're often trying to decide which cloud operator. And the hardest part is when organizations don't know their data or why they're using the data, then trying to decide what cloud provider, it is a bit like, well, they're all the same for you then, go on the price. But if you do understand the value of your data, you want to be putting the data that you need to use all the time with the best processing power.
And so there'll be differentiations between the different cloud providers by user, and that means that competition is happening now based on some of these innovations and differentiations. If there's equivalence required, what I would do as a cloud operator is say, okay, I won't bring out my best innovations in Europe, because if I do, I have to share them with the others, and it's not clear I'll be paid for the investment that I've made. So there's real risk, substantial risk, that European businesses will have less capabilities offered to them in the long run if this equivalence is really enforced strictly. And it's not a pipe dream to think this. I mean, we are seeing now that some companies are not introducing features in Europe, right? For you want your iPhone with AI on it in Europe. Sorry, it's not going to be available right now. Maybe sometime in the future when rules are clearer, hopefully. But that's just one example from another domain that's illustrating how some features are going to be kept out of Europe if the rules are strict and different here, and I worry about that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a profound concern, and I think that this is something also that we'll touch on a little bit more in the forthcoming podcast regarding cloud. We're going to think about analogies in the cloud, in particular. In the paper that Sean and I have written, we've considered flaws in the analogy between cloud and open banking, and to an extent also telecommunications. I think absolutely there is seemingly in Europe, certainly through the EU Data Act, a kind of an oversimplification of the market as a view. And I suppose that also something that comes out of our paper and out of our research, and certainly in the academic literature concerning the cloud, is that actually consumers are not only capable, but have the incentives ex ante at contract stage to account for this trade-off between complexity, customization on the one hand, and then portability, interoperability, switching on the other. We talked earlier about sophistication, and I think it's the right word to use. We have a chart in our paper, which we would recommend is obligatory reading now. I abuse my position as chair to say that. But I think, that we have this chart which kind of says, look, customer sophistication changes, but generally at the layer where this regulation is most heavily targeted, so the equivalence, which we'll discuss in more detail in a forthcoming podcast. But this requirement is very much targeted at infrastructure as a service. And what we find from the literature is that actually those consumers of infrastructure as a service, and to a great extent platform as a service as well, are actually relatively sophisticated. I mean, they can account for and probably would test ex ante the ability not just to port data but to port applications. And so I suppose that the big issue for Sean and I think there's consensus around the table on this certainly, is that, an oversimplified view, which is perhaps a caricature, that might be okay in a market study, but when it translates into regulation that's, I won't say rushed through, but certainly moved at a pretty rapid pace, the Data Act, I think there's very much cause for concern, and for other jurisdictions who are looking at this. The CMA is kind of gently toying with the idea of a functional equivalence requirement, gently toying with the idea of mirroring some of the Data Act's provisions. And I guess that the lesson here is maybe use Europe as a natural experiment, perhaps, see if it works, see what happens. And as Sean rightly says, I mean, if we see that this impacts negatively on the incentives of firms to innovate, to bring out this rich kind of rainforest of diverse services, then perhaps don't hit copy-paste on the EU's provisions and put them into other texts.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Nex Gen podcast by LIDC. To stay up to date with future episodes, we invite you to visit the LIDC website and subscribe to this channel. We look forward to having you with us again.